Hi everyone and welcome. We're going to talk about implicit bias and inclusion in the video game industry. My name is Celia Hodent. I have a PhD in psychology and I've been working in the video games industry for over 10 years now at Ubisoft, LucasArts, and Epic Games, where I was Director of User Experience until 2017. I've been working in freelance ever since then. Inclusion is a very important topic and the video game industry is not very inclusive. So we're going to talk about that and we're going to talk about implicit bias. Let's start with a little game. Pick a card and try to remember that card as accurately as you can. It's going to go pretty fast. Okay, I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear. Did it work? What happened here is I've changed all the cards. This trick can work if you focus on one card and therefore did not really pay attention to the other cards. In psychology, this is called change blindness and it's a very strong phenomenon. It's illustrating that our attention resources are very scarce. Overall, the brain has a lot of flaws. This diagram is illustrating a very simplified version of what's going on in the brain when we learn something and when we process information. And it starts with perception and it ends with a change in our memory. And there are a lot of influencing factors changing the quality of the information processing, including intention. The problem is that even though our brain has a lot of capabilities, it also has a lot of limitations. Our perception is subjective, our attention is scarce, and our memory is fallible. And this is what UX is all about. It's considering human factors, human flaws, when we design objects, systems, and services. This is why we're using a framework so we can identify problems and change the system so that we can offer the best game that we want for our players. It's important to anticipate how people are going to use an environment so that we can design the system accordingly. And so the lack of inclusion in the game industry is also a systemic issue which can be tackled with a UX mindset. It's all about understanding how the environment is going to favor human flaws. In that case, the environment is the hiring process and the career development process, for example. But why is diversity important? Let me show you a short video illustrating that pretty clearly.
Nice. Okay, Noel, you try now. Onto your hand. Two black. Yeah. Come again. Come again, Sash. No, two black. Probably. They get. What you have to do is how racialist thing is. Yeah. As long as that is white. It's a napkin, I'm sure again. Again, put me up again, napkin again. Right, what's it called in my hand? Man, black man ain't fine.
Of course, we find that funny because it's a soap dispenser, but if you think about a health device, then it's a whole different story. The reason why this is happening is because the people who designed the soap dispenser are very likely white, and they didn't even think about testing this dispenser with other skin tones. This is the reason why you need a diverse team so that the product or the video game that you're making is going to offer the best experience to everyone. The problem is that we have a lot of cognitive biases. Our brains are pretty flawed. So that's the reason why we need to understand those biases that are most of the time implicit so that we can fix the system accordingly. Here's an example. It's called the Linda problem. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more likely, that Linda is 1, a bank teller, or 2, is a bank teller and is active in a feminist movement? If intuitively you answer 2, you fell for the conjunction fallacy. Of course, the probability of being one thing is always greater than of being two things. Nonetheless, 85% of respondents to that question fell for the bias. This experiment is described in the book Thinking Fast and Slow from Daniel Kahneman, who did a lot of research on biases. He's a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. In this book, Daniel Kahneman explains that the brain has two systems, two ways of thinking. System 1 that is fast, automatic, and effortless. That's the system that we use most of the time. The brain is making countless decisions all day long. we can't spend a lot of time thinking deeply about each and every one of them. We also have system 2. This one is slow, controlled, and effortful. That's the system we need to put in place if we have to do a very complex mental calculation, solve a problem, think outside the box, make important decisions. But system 1 is very biased. This is the system that makes us fall into traps. To avoid falling into traps, we need system 2 to be aware that there is a trap, but most of the time it is not. And this is why most people fall for a bias in the Linda problem. That bias is called the representativeness heuristic. It's a mental shortcut used when making judgments about the probability of an event under uncertainty. You need to think about these cognitive biases very much like perceptive illusions. Like in this image, the squares A and B have exactly the same color. You probably don't believe me right now, but if I remove the rest of the image, you can clearly see now that they are the same color. Even when we know that there is a bias, we still fall for it. Cognitive biases are very much like that. They are implicit. So even though we know that they exist, we're still going to fall for them. A few examples of these biases that are perpetuating discrimination is the in-group bias, for example. It's a tendency to give preferential treatment to others we perceive as belonging to our own group. For example, I'm a woman, I'm white, I love video games. I'm going to give a preferential treatment to the people that I perceive belong to my group. Of course, I'm not going to do it on purpose, but this is still going to happen. We connect more easily to people who look like us. Another one is the halo effect. It's about spilling over positive or negative traits from one personality area to another. For example, if you admire one of your colleagues because they did an amazing job on a game, it's going to be hard for you to believe that that person also did a bad thing. And so these biases are influencing us to make bad decisions, and they're polluting our critical thinking. According to Harvard Business Review, during hiring processes, sometimes the same skills or the same behavior are not going to be judged in the same way depending on race, ethnicity, or gender of the candidates. For example, Black and Hispanic men were often seen as lacking polish and moved to the reject pile, even when they were strong in other areas, whereas white men who lacked polish were deemed coachable and kept in the running. A similar pattern emerged among men who appeared shy, nervous, or understated. Non-whites were rejected for being unassertive, but in white people, modesty was seen as a virtue. Among candidates who made minor mistakes in math, women were rejected for not having the right skills, and men were given a pass. Interviewers assumed that they were having an off day. Again, most of the time, we don't realize that this is what we're doing. So this is why we need to change the way we hire people so that we don't fall for these biases. Since humans are so biased, could artificial intelligence help us? Well, let's take an example. In Turkish, there is no gender, unlike in English. So if you type in Google Translate, he is a doctor or she is a doctor, you'll get the same phrase translated in Turkish, o bir doctor. Now, if you take that phrase from Turkish and get it translated to English, you will obtain he is a doctor. Now, if you take the Turkish phrase o bir hemşire, which is about being a nurse, now you'll get she is a nurse. AI is only perpetuating human biases, so it's not going to help us. So what can we do? In my opinion, what's going to help is to understand how the environment is shaping people's behavior. This is pretty much like doing UX for a video game. Because when players don't have the experience that we hope for them, we don't ask them to change their behavior. We change the environment instead. We change the game. We iterate on it. And this is what we need to do with the workplace environment. We need to understand what is it at the workplace that is making people fall for their biases and not be inclusive. So let's change the system. So to change this system, we can use what we call nudges. Nudges are a way to influence people to do the right thing when they interact with the environment. A simple example of a nudge would be a door with a plate on the side where we need to push it. The way the door is designed is influencing you to interact with it in the most efficient way. A famous example of that is from Amsterdam Airport. A cleaning manager there wanted to reduce spillage around urinals.
Instead of asking people to keep the place clean through messages, he added stickers of fly on the urinals right next to the drain. The idea was to give people something to aim at. Turns out it resulted in an 80% decrease in urinal spillage. You guys are pretty playful, apparently. So if you're working on improving inclusion in your company, you need, for example, to design the hiring process in such a way to reduce race and gender biases. One example of that is by doing blind interviews. Back in the 70s in the US, orchestras did not have a lot of women, and so we could wonder why was that? Is it that women are not as good musicians as men? Or is it that there is a bias during the recruitment process because most people in jury were white men? Maybe because of the in-group bias, they were hiring people that looked like them. So at some point, what they did is they added a curtain during auditions. That way, they would hire people only based on their talent and not on how they look. After they did that, they observed a plus 30 to 55% of women hired in orchestras. They had to iterate on that process, by the way, because at the beginning they did not have any carpet, and so sometimes they could hear women with high heels. Some people say that they're colorblind and they don't evaluate people on how they look, but only on their skills. We have to be very wary of that because most of the time, well, it's bullshit. And even if we think that we are inclusive, we are going to be influenced by our biases. There's no way we can escape that. And even if we try hard not to be influenced by how people look or how they sound, we will. It's implicit. So we need to really realize that so that we can understand our biases better, so that we can change the environment to avoid these biases. There are a lot of things to say about that, of course, but in 15 minutes it's not possible. So to conclude, designing for inclusion is not only the right thing to do humanely, it's also good business. You'll reach a broader audience. To design for inclusion, you need diversity and inclusion on your teams to counter blind spots and expertise. To have diversity on your team, you have to combat implicit biases within your hiring and promotion processes. We cannot control these biases. Please remember that. This is not something that you can control. What you can control is the environment. You can change a hiring process, for example. So use nudges. According to Daniel Kahneman, people who are cognitively busy are also more likely to make selfish choices, use sexist language, and make superficial judgments in social situations. And we know how cognitively busy we are in the game industry. So this is why it would be a fallacy to try to train people against biases. What's important is to know these biases so we can change the environment instead. And we mostly talked about discrimination against women and people of color, but there are many other discriminations, like against older people, disabled people, LGBTQ+ communities, etc. We have a lot of work to do. The brain is very good at making sense of the environment with very little information. This is how we survive the predators. But the problem is that the brain is also highly biased. We're going to often jump to the wrong conclusions. And most of the time, we're not aware of it. This is why we need to understand how the brain works, to understand its flaws, to understand our biases, so we can design better environments for our games, at the workplace, and in society. If we really care about stopping discrimination and make the world a better place for everyone, we really need to start to understand how we contribute to that injustice, most of the time implicitly. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm so sorry I cannot be on the Discord channel at the moment, but I'll be there tomorrow, Thursday at 6 p.m. at the Meet the Speakers if you have any questions. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on my Twitter channel at Celia Hodent. And you'll find a bunch of resources on my website, celiahodent.com. And I will probably post an article on the topic of inclusion and implicit bias in the upcoming days or weeks. Thank you so much again, and have a nice day.